Welcome to part 2 of the video presentation explaining why our emissions of carbon dioxide are inefficient, explaining what inefficiency means, and illustrating how there are ways we could remove that inefficiency. Now, the bulk of the explanation was all in part 1, so go back and watch that if you haven't seen that yet. But there were some questions we left unresolved at the end of that. You'll recall that we suggested you could remove the inefficiency if you could allow trade between present generations who are emitting carbon dioxide and the future generations that will be victims, as it were, will suffer the harms caused by those emissions. Here were the questions that were unresolved by our presentation. First, we needed to analyze it in those terms, we needed to ascribe monetary values to emitting carbon dioxide. So we said that it was worth to us as emitters $10 to emit our last ton of carbon dioxide. And we said it was worth to the victims $60 to be relieved of that last ton of carbon emissions. Now, where on earth do those values come from? The second question is, in a way, the most fundamental one. That is, how in reality are we going to bring about trade between generations? That was a crucial assumption of the explanation that we could somehow remove the inefficiency. So let's now address both these questions. First, how do we determine the dollar values for our emissions? Well, when I said it was worth to us a mere $10 to emit our last ton of carbon, I was basing that upon a very simple idea, which is that I actually can reduce my emissions by 1 ton for about $10 by purchasing a carbon offset. If you just Google the phrase carbon offset, you'll find there are a number of companies who are promising to go out and change the behavior of other people in the world by sort of making people use more carbon dioxide efficient technologies in such a way that they will reduce the net amount of carbon dioxide emitted by 1 ton. Therefore, your purchase for $10 of that offset does reduce the world's emissions by 1 ton. So in effect, that is that's equivalent to your not emitting the last ton of carbon dioxide. So that price of $10 is reasonably accurate for someone like you right now. Note, however, that the global demand for carbon offsetting at the moment is extremely low. It's only a few very conscientious people like you who might be contemplating purchasing such a carbon offset. Now, if the world gets very serious about taking profound measures to mitigate climate change, then there is going to be much, much more demand for carbon offsets, because these very measures are the sorts of ways that we're going to try to reduce emissions in the present. So if demand went up, you could expect that price to go up quite substantially. So there's a big caveat over that $10 price. It's subject to the amount of demand, and at the moment, demand is pretty low. Okay. What about the other dollar value, which was the $60 value I said future generations might ascribe to our not emitting that ton of carbon dioxide? Working this out is extremely complicated. It requires both climate science to be done to estimate, well, what is the effect going to be of increasing our emissions or of maintaining our current level of emissions, working out the effect of that over many, many years, and how it will affect many, many people across the whole range of economic circumstances that people live in. So this requires not merely climate science, but also economics. Arguably, it also sort of draws upon political questions, because people worry about migration and conflict occurring as a result of climate change. So this is really just a bit of a guess, a bit of a ballpark figure. If you look at a more scholarly source than just my little videos, for instance, the IPCC's 4th assessment report from 2007, often abbreviated not FAR, but as AR4, I should say. Assessment Report 4. Working Group 3 published a report on mitigating climate change. And if you look at section 3.5.3.3 of that, they'll give you a figure. They say their estimate of the social cost of carbon, as it's called, that is the cost to society across all people of emitting a ton of carbon dioxide now, is, and they give this figure in US dollars per ton of carbon dioxide. They say, well, we think it's somewhere between $8 and $189. That's a pretty huge range, as you can tell. And that reflects the enormous uncertainty around all of these factors. But most models are agreed that the most likely figure is going to be a figure that is greater than the cost to us. And that is the basic thought. You don't need to be absolutely sure that it's 60 and 10. To determine that it's inefficient, you just have to determine that this figure is more than this one. The cost to us of reducing is lower than the cost to others of our emitting. Okay, so that gives you at least some sense of how we might go about answering question 1. What about question 2? How do we bring about trade between the generations? Well, at first this might seem a bizarre notion that you could trade with people. If you think about it, there are a number of things that we're doing now which affect how well off future generations are. For instance, we build big infrastructure projects like bridges. And these bridges, they don't suddenly collapse as soon as we have stopped using them, right? We expect them to last for tens of years, maybe even hundreds of years after we've built them. Think about much of the infrastructure we're using right now. Much of it was built before we were born. It was built by earlier generations who were happy to leave us the benefits of that infrastructure. Not only bridges, but roads, buildings, like the buildings of the university you might be attending. And there are other things that aren't so much infrastructure, but sheer resources, right? So imagine a great big hole in the ground full of gold, a gold mine, right? By the time you and I are dead, this gold mine might still be, 50% full. More resources left for those future generations to use. And this goes not just for gold, but for uranium, coal, iron ore, precious earth metals, all manner of resources. Now, if we were going to leave, for instance, 50% of the gold to future generations, and what we want to do to bring about trade between the generations is to somehow transfer resources from the future to the present, then we can simply use up more of the gold. Or when flaws develop in our infrastructure, such as potholes in the roads, rather than repairing it the way we normally might, so it can be enjoyed in good condition by future generations, we could simply leave the pothole there, which is in effect, again, compensating us. It's benefiting us. We're not spending as much on benefits to be enjoyed by people in the future. And so it's a fairly indirect but effective way of transferring resources from future consumption to present generation consumption. A big concern, of course, is this is somewhat messy, right? How do we guarantee that the right people in future miss out on using the gold and the right people in the present enjoy using the gold, or similarly with the potholes? So this may not be a terribly precise method, but at least shows that in principle it's possible. One last obvious technology though, you can go to the bank and take out a great big loan, at least you can't do this, but the government can, that will be repaid by future taxpayers. Maybe we could set up some sort of global institution, some sort of global credit scheme, whereby we will pay the world population now to reduce their carbon emissions, and unfortunately future generations will have to bear the cost of paying back that loan, but as we explained in the previous video, they may well prefer that to bearing the cost of our carbon emissions unmitigated.